How does the Linux kernel work when installing Linux distros? Imagine turning on your computer and watching it come to life, hardware waking up, and the system preparing itself for use. That's where the Linux kernel steps in. When you install a Linux distribution, the kernel is the core piece that makes everything possible. It all starts after your computer's firmware, either BIOS or UEFI, finishes checking your hardware. The firmware then hands control over to a small program called a bootloader, like grub. The bootloader's job is to find the Linux kernel image, which is usually stored in a compressed file called vmlinux or bz image on the boot partition. Once it finds it, the bootloader loads this image into your computer's memory. After loading, the kernel decompresses itself and begins its startup process. It detects what kind of CPU your system has, how much memory is available, and what hardware devices are connected. The kernel uses device drivers, which are small programs that help it communicate with hardware like your graphics card, network card, and storage drives. This process ensures your hardware is ready for use. The kernel then mounts a temporary file system called initramfs, which contains essential tools and drivers needed to access the real root file system stored on your disk. Once the kernel has mounted the real root file system, it starts the first user space process called init. This is usually systemed or sysvinit, and it acts as the manager for all other system services. The init process begins setting up your system by starting services like network connections, user interfaces, and other background tasks. It also mounts additional file systems if needed, and finally presents you with a login prompt or graphical interface to start using your system. During the installation of a Linux distribution, the kernel's role is to support hardware and provide a stable environment for the installer program. The installer is a user space application that runs after the kernel and init are active. It uses the kernel's device drivers to access your storage devices, network, and peripherals. This allows it to copy system files, set up partitions, and configure your new Linux system. Different Linux distributions might use slightly different methods or init systems, but the kernel's main functions stay the same: hardware detection, mounting file systems, and enabling user space programs to run smoothly. In essence, when you're installing a Linux distro, the kernel is the first piece that wakes up and makes everything work. It loads, detects, and prepares your hardware, then hands over control to the init process, which starts the installer and gets your system ready for use. Without the kernel, none of this would happen. It's the foundation that keeps your Linux system running from the very first moment.